I'm governor, we're going to follow the law and the Constitution, regardless of who it helps or harms politically.
To me, it's a no-brainer if you're asking the question as to whether you're going to support a convicted felon as the nominee of the party, and I can't do that.
I don't know what the underlying issue is, but we all wish him well.
Ethics cannot simply be left to the discretion of the nation's highest court. The court should have a code of conduct with clear and enforceable rules.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. The Capitol attending physician now says Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is, quote, medically clear to continue with his schedule. The doctor put out that statement a day after McConnell appeared to freeze during an exchange with reporters in Kentucky. The physician wrote, quote, occasional lightheadedness is not uncommon in concussion recovery and can also be expected as a result of dehydration. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarland joins us now. Scott, before we begin, I'd like to play a comment today from Senator John Cornyn of Texas.
I talked to Senator McConnell yesterday, and he seems to be doing fine. I don't know what the underlying issue is, but we all wish him well. We know he's had a fall and a concussion, and I think that, this may be just part of the recovery process from that.
Scott, Senator Cornyn of Texas, as you well know, is someone who was often mentioned as a possible successor to the longest-serving Republican leader in Senate history. And when you look at this delicate moment in Senate Republican politics, what's your latest reporting about how Senator Cornyn and others behind the scenes are handling this moment?
Ultimately, there's a diplomacy that's required, but also a diplomacy that's a tradition in the U.S. Senate, Bob. And this transcends party. You have members of the Senate who tend not to question each other's health in a public, notorious way. It's one of the rare bipartisan dynamics that persists here in Washington. We know that immediately after this episode, Mitch McConnell was working the phones. Multiple sources tell CBS News McConnell was reaching out to that leadership team, which includes Senator Cornyn. But I also just got an email, I'll read it to you now, from Congressman Jim Banks of Indiana, who met with McConnell after the incident and posted about it on Twitter. And Banks is running for a Senate seat in Indiana and has reason to be engaged with Senator McConnell at this moment. The email says the leader was engaging and very dialed in on my race in Indiana. He's obviously following very closely. He answered many questions from guests and seemed to be doing fine. And the president also said he spoke to Senator McConnell by phone and that he sounded like his old self. So you're getting these endorsements about McConnell's health, or at least his current state of affairs, from his colleagues, which, Bob, is exactly what happened in July. When McConnell had that similar episode here at the U.S. Capitol, it was his own colleagues in the hours after saying, he seems fine, he's doing fine.
But that is not a chorus across the line. Some Republicans today are speaking out with their concern about whether he should remain as leader. I haven't heard anyone talk about whether he should leave the Senate or make any dramatic statement about him somehow resigning quickly. But some have spoken about the need to maybe leave that leadership position. Let's listen to Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley.
It's sad. No one should feel good about seeing that. Any more than we should feel good about seeing Dianne Feinstein, any more than we should feel good about a lot of what's happening or seeing Joe Biden's decline. What I will say is right now the Senate is the most privileged nursing home in the country. I mean, Mitch McConnell has done some great things and he deserves credit, but you have to know when to leave.
McConnell is one of the most powerful people in Washington, especially in Republican politics. He is someone who commands loyalty, respect from so many of his current aides, his former aides. He has this network led by people like Josh Holmes, seasoned Republican strategists around Washington, who really have kept not just McConnell front and center, but the McConnell orbit front and center in Republican politics. So to hear Nikki Haley, the former ambassador, speak like that publicly is perhaps a crack in how Republicans are publicly talking about McConnell. But to your point, Scott, do you see any further cracks along these lines in the coming days? You say that most people are just at this point keeping an arm's length.
Yeah, there's a difference between equivocating about something and not talking about something. And this is in the not talking about something category. The only comments that senators are offering are those under direct questioning. They're not giving unsolicited opinions. And they're making clear that they believe Senator McConnell has shown himself still able to lead, and that it's his decision and his constituents' decision if he chooses to run for re-election. That's the baseline from where we start. But the reality of this is it's still a 51-49 Senate where any extended absence has the potential to be pivotal, impactful on the business here. You heard Nikki Haley reference Senator Feinstein. Senator Feinstein's absence earlier this year was for several weeks as she was hospitalized with complications from shingles and also suffered a fall. Her absence was, to put it mildly, notorious. It really halted a lot of the business of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Any extended absence is of concern, not just to the party, but to the Senate overall. You just see them clinging to this one senatorial tradition of not questioning each other's health, not doing so publicly. That all being said, Bob, as you well know, they're back here the day after Labor Day, and they'll have the traditional party meetings and party lunches midweek. Hard to imagine this isn't a focus, if not the focus of conversation.
Scott, turning to the ongoing investigations of January 6th and former President Trump, you have the former president now pleading not guilty in Georgia, not showing up for an arraignment. Surprising to you?
Not at all. And here's the thing, Bob. Though Donald Trump has seen this adrenaline rush each time he has an interaction with the criminal justice system, even though his campaign numbers seem to grow up and fundraising seems to soar, in this case, in the case of appearing Wednesday in person in Fulton County, if he had chosen to do so, he seems to have less control of the optics. When he was at the jail surrendering last week, his entrance into the jail was kept away from photographers. There were no cameras inside. The only thing we saw, Bob, was Trump Force One, the jet emblazoned with his name touching down at an airport, and something akin to a presidential motorcade bringing him to that spot where he could speak. He controlled the optics. Same was true when he was here in Washington, D.C. for his arraignment in early August. He entered the courthouse through an underground garage, out of sight of photographers who are banned from going in the courthouse. He controlled the optics. If he went Wednesday to do this arraignment in person, and it wasn't expected he was going to, he runs the risk, Bob, of looking like any other criminal defendant in a courthouse where cameras are permitted, walking through the door that other alleged criminals walk through.
And Scott, quickly, the Proud Boys, what's the latest on sentencing on that front?
4 Proud Boys convicted of seditious conspiracy are sentenced between now and Tuesday. 2 of them were sentenced today. One of them, named Joe Biggs, gets 17 years, 13 to 16 years less than prosecutors recommended. Another, Zach Reel of Philadelphia, sentenced to 15 years, about half of what prosecutors wanted, but also among the longest prison sentences in any of the 1,100 cases so far. We're all waiting for Tuesday afternoon, though, Bob, when Enrique Tarrio, who was the head of this organization with Zach Reel and Joe Biggs, faces his sentencing. Prosecutors recommending 33 years for Tarrio.
Scott McFarland, we appreciate your time and your reporting. As always, a lot to follow. So many different dynamics on Capitol Hill and on the campaign trail. We'll see you soon. And many of the Republican presidential candidates, they're going to spend Labor Day weekend on the campaign trail as they look ahead to that next primary debate. I spoke with former Governor Asa Hutchison about whether or not he believes he'll make that stage at the Reagan Library. That's next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The Republican presidential field, it's tightening. Earlier this week, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez became the first presidential hopeful to drop his bid. Now, nearly a dozen Republicans remain in the running, including, of course, the frontrunner, former President Donald Trump. But yesterday, I spoke with the former Arkansas governor and current Republican presidential contender, Asa Hutchison. You might recall at last week's debate, he said he would not support Trump if Trump was convicted in the coming months. Here's part of our conversation. Joining us now is Governor Asa Hutchison, the former governor of Arkansas. Thanks for being here. We appreciate it. You made a name for yourself on the debate stage with many Republican voters who were just starting to pay attention to your campaign. The question now is, looking down the horizon politically, is will you make that next debate stage, Governor, in your view, that's going to be held at the Reagan Library in California in late September?
The answer is yes, we're going to make that. We surprised everybody because we were on the last debate stage. We were one of 8 that made that and qualified for it. So we're going to continue that momentum into the next debate. And people have consistently underestimated our campaign. but each time the voters, the supporters, they say, we want Asa on the debate stage, we want to hear his message, and so we're delighted with the momentum that we have. We're going to carry that forward.
Listening to you on stage and listening to you on the campaign trail, it's clear you are articulating a version of Ronald Reagan's view of how Republican politics should play out, a more traditional conservatism. But that's counter to what's happened under former President Trump, the rise of nationalism in the ranks of the GOP. How do you see that tension right now in your party?
Well, it exists, and you have to acknowledge it, and I'm guilty. I am a Reagan Republican in the sense that I believe in individual responsibility, a limited role of government, an opportunity for everyone. And I believe that America has a leadership role in the world. And so that's Reagan's philosophy, and I was schooled under that. I believe in it, and I think it's important. Now, you have to apply that to the future. This race is about the future and how we're going to get back to a balanced budget, how we're going to get our economy moving again.
When you were on that debate stage, you were asked about whether you could support the nominee of the party, if it's former President Trump, let's say, should that nominee be convicted of a crime. You did not raise your hand. Others on stage did raise their hand. What does that reveal about them?
Well, it might reflect a fear of Donald Trump, and that
you think they're scared of Trump?
Well, he has such control out there, and to me, you've got to stand up. And whenever you look at the fact that Donald Trump is leading in the Republican primary, you don't back off, you go at him. You make sure that you showcase an alternative way for leadership in our country and our party. And that's what I did. And to me, it's a no-brainer if you're asking the question as to whether you're going to support a convicted felon as the nominee of the party, and I can't do that. And I don't believe that's required either under our rules. But you've got to put the country above anything else.
What would you do if the Republicans stood behind a convicted felon as their nominee? What would you do personally? Would you vote for a write-in candidate? Would you go with an independent candidate potentially? What would you do?
Well, I'm not going to support Joe Biden. I'm not going to support the Democrats. I've always supported the Republican nominee, and I expect to do that again. What we showcase in the debate is that there's 8 candidates out there that can lead our country. I showcase that I can lead the country, and I'm ready to be president. And so I'm confident we're going to have a nominee other than Donald Trump, and we're going to work hard to make sure that happens. So I don't think we're going to have to address that question. But whenever you're asked, I've got to give honest answers, and no, we've got to go a different direction.
You've heard it out there among some lawyers, some secretaries of state across the country, wondering constitutionally, is Trump allowed to be on the ballot due to what happened on January 6th? What's your view as a lawyer and as a candidate of this question?
I think the 14th Amendment that prohibits someone that is guilty of insurrection, of holding federal public office again, is applicable to these circumstances. And so it's another cloud that hangs over Donald Trump. It could put us in a position, if he's the nominee of our party, then he's held ineligible by the Supreme Court or by lower courts. Then this is a gift to the Democrats. It's a gift to Joe Biden. And that's why they would love to see him the nominee and all of a sudden be disqualified. These are real legitimate concerns, both in terms of the indictments that are pending, but also the 14th Amendment questions surrounding his candidacy. That should be an alarm bell and saying, we need somebody that will put the country above party, and that we need to go a different direction.
On that debate stage in Milwaukee, I was there, you were on stage, I was covering it, and I noticed watching it that it was you and former Governor Christie who were perhaps most sharp-edged when it came to critiquing former President Trump and the possibility of him being the nominee. If you were out in Iowa, or maybe New Hampshire or South Carolina, and a voter was choosing between Hutchison and Christie for that kind of candidate, for someone who's going to stand up to Trump, what makes you the better candidate, the best candidate for that type of voter?
Because I'm a nationwide candidate that can appeal across the board. Whenever you look at the fact that Chris Christie's not campaigning in Iowa, I think the fact that I'm campaigning in both places and in South Carolina showcases I'll be a national candidate that can win in November, but also succeed against Donald Trump. And I have a high regard for Chris Christie. He's been honest. He's been straightforward. We're both federal prosecutors, but I know how to balance a budget. I've done that in Arkansas for 8 years. I know how to lower taxes. I know how to grow the private sector of the economy, and I think those characteristics distinguish me.
Final thing here, Governor. You're on the campaign trail. You're clearly determined to stay in this race, to fight on, to build your own campaign and your message. But what do you say to those like Senator Mitt Romney of Utah and others in the party who have urged the field to narrow, to consolidate as soon as possible, to stop Trump? You're staying in the race. What do you say to those who say this field has to get smaller soon?
Well, Mitt Romney gave a date right before Super Tuesday, but it was after the first 4 states vote. And so that's a time frame that at least makes sense in terms of let the voters have the first cut at determining who should move forward in the campaign. But anytime I'm making the debate stage, anytime I've got an important message and a vision for America, I'm staying in this to win.
He's staying in. He's moving on. Former Governor Asa Hutchison of Arkansas, we appreciate you stopping by America Decides. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
We'll keep tracking all of these candidates and new financial disclosure forms for Justices Thomas and Alito. They were made public today. Coming up next, we'll look at what came to light and the potential implications. You're streaming America Decides.
Liberal Democrats have been trying to destroy the Roberts Court for quite a while now because they don't like the outcome of certain decisions. Now we have high-profile cases of justices taking trips. Two things can be true. The court probably needs to address that issue. I think they do. I believe they will. And Congress needs to stay out of the court's business.
Welcome back to America Decides. That was Senator Lindsey Graham making comments earlier this summer on the potential for Supreme Court reform and an overhaul of legislation related to it. But over the last few months, Justices Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito have faced increasing scrutiny over ethics and disclosure issues. Their detailed financial disclosures were made public today. Thomas reported several private jet trips and a vacation funded by Republican donor Harlan Crow. He also said he, quote, inadvertently omitted information from previous reports. This includes a life insurance policy for his wife, a personal bank account, and a real estate deal between him and Harlan Crow in 2014. CBS News chief legal correspondent Jen Crawford joins us now. Jen, thanks for being here. What matters in these new reports?
Well, I mean, the question is, was this intentional, right? And we've seen a lot of criticism from Senate Democrats, specifically Sheldon Whitehouse, saying the Justice Department needs to investigate Justice Thomas. These clearly were willful omissions that he, didn't want us to know about. But he makes, I think, pretty clear in the report today, and some of the stuff that he says and explaining it, and then an extraordinary statement from his lawyer saying this was totally inadvertent. Under the old rules, he got guidance from court officials that he did not have to disclose some of this private travel that he's gotten so much criticism for with his rich friends. And so now that rules have changed, he is disclosing it. So that's why we saw today he disclosed 3 trips on Harlan Crow, his friend's private plane. In the past, he contends he did not have to disclose that, and that's why he didn't. We also saw him try to clean up some of the stuff that, again, he thought, he says was an inadvertent omission, as you pointed out. And so he cleaned that up. So I think, there's really not a lot of there that this was willful. I mean, that's his attorney's argument. And I think short of that, what we see is kind of this drumbeat now on the Hill that the Supreme Court needs to have some kind of code of conduct on its own. It's a way of focusing attention on the court, certainly by Democrats, because, they're very unhappy with the direction of this Supreme Court. And some of the decisions are completely at odds with what they think a Supreme Court should be doing. And that's why you're seeing a lot of calls also to increase the membership of the Supreme Court. You've covered the court. You've written books about the court. For those of us who aren't steeped in it day to day like yourself, what is the constitutionality of oversight of the Supreme Court?
Where does Congress have a role, if any, the Justice Department, if any?
You know, some of the, as you, and as someone who's covered this town a long time, as you know, you can find an expert who will say almost anything. And so you're going to have experts who say, well, it's probably constitutional. Congress can have a role. But then you're going to have other people who say, absolutely not. I mean, separation of powers is super important. And there is no way that Congress can come in and have oversight over the Supreme Court and what its justices do or don't. And my guess is the justices will agree with that. So it's almost less kind of like, can they, discipline justices? I think their argument would be absolutely not. But the justices themselves are under now kind of the microscope and the pressure to adopt this code of conduct because of all of this drumbeat of criticism now that you're hearing. Justice Kagan this summer talked about it at an event, and she said, look, yeah, it's no secret that we've been discussing this. We've been discussing adopting a, quote, code of conduct, but there's a division. There's 9 people, and it's hard to get 9 people to agree on anything. So I think that's where the court is now, and that's the direction they're moving in, something voluntary that certainly would not involve, any kind of like, sanctions or any ability for Congress to hold them to account.
And should the court make its own new code of conduct, that's not necessarily legally binding. It seems like the only action I've ever seen Congress in history take with the court is it could impeach a federal judge, including a Supreme Court justice. It could remove them from office. But otherwise, there's very limited oversight.
And I think that's why you're seeing some of the language now that you're seeing from Justice Thomas and his supporters who are saying, like, listen, I mean, you've heard some Democrats on the Hill suggest maybe Justice Thomas should be impeached because he hasn't disclosed some of this. You're starting to see some pushback now. The statement, the release of this disclosure report today and some of his language, his attorney's language, there was a letter signed by 100 of his law clerks saying he's a man of integrity. There's no evidence that there was any kind of conflict of interest, that he was any kind of pay for play. These are friends of his. So I think that's why, people are just trying to say, like, okay, enough of this, weaponization of ethics reports, as his lawyer put it today. What are the facts? It was unintentional. It was inadvertent. He's going to disclose these trips going forward, starting today, starting with this year's report. And that's what he's done in his filing.
You've covered Chief Justice Roberts, and you've really put an emphasis on understanding him. The court has now walked into this turbulent moment, at least in terms of how the public sees it, maybe not legally. How does he see it, or at least his associates and allies see this crossroads for the court?
Oh, I think it's absolutely terrible. I think they all realize that it's a real problem for the court because the court's legitimacy turns on whether or not the public is going to accept its opinions and see them as legitimate. Now, I covered Bush versus Gore. I mean, I've been around for a long time. That was a very controversial decision that divided people along partisan lines and the justices, by the way. But people accepted that. Would that happen today in the climate that we're in the polarized climate, in the era of social media? What if this court decided Bush versus Gore today? I don't know. I mean, that's a really troubling question with all of our institutions now kind of under attack, being undermined. And I think that's a real concern, whether you're on the left or the right. Any efforts now to undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court are things that you should take really seriously. And if you're accusing justices of wrongful behavior or making allegations, you need to make sure that you really have something to back those up, because it's a troubling point, I think, for our whole democracy. And I think the justices are all well aware of that.
Jan Crawford, we appreciate your reporting. Thank you. And that does it for our program today. You can stream America Decides Monday to Thursday, 5 p.m. Eastern. You're streaming CBS News.